Hello, sociologists, scholars, and deep thinkers. This is our first discussion about crime and deviance, which is a huge topic. I'll put my wine down, which is a huge topic, and I have long taught a 10-week criminology class that dives into this topic, but we're going to just take a little slice of it. And as we've talked about in Zoom, hopefully, the concept of what is and isn't a crime is a social construction of reality. Things that can be criminal one day can be legalized the next. Think about legalized pot use in Oregon, right? I mean, that was criminalized for a long time, and there's a lot of people still sitting in prison for having a little bit of weed on them. And now you can go right up to the corner store and buy you some fine bud or some edibles or some tinctures. I don't know these things. Maui Wowie. Yeah. So it was heavily It's still a federal crime, by the way. So don't think that you're getting off the hook just because you could buy it locally. And then there are things that were legal, and are now illegal. So, for example, racial segregation used to be the law of the land, used to be the norm, especially in the South, the old Jim Crow laws, and now racial segregation is against the law. We're not allowed to racially discriminate, and I think that's a good thing. So it can change. You can change. Driving and talking on your cell phone or texting is a crime in Oregon. $500 fine. And when you get back to driving, whatever that may be, 2023, please don't drive and text. I was on my bike one time and I was hit by a woman on her cell phone, and I'm lying in the middle of the street, Northeast Portland, and she's on her phone like, "Oh my God, I just hit someone. Maybe I should call 911." I'm like, "Yeah, please." And so, what is a crime and what isn't a crime. And so we're going to talk about this notion of the line and where you draw the line, and how things are determined to be criminal. And we'll get into this question. There are sort of three questions that sociologists ask. So we think about this in our discussion. We've kind of already talked about this. We were talking about our norms, right? We were talking about norms range from folkways, how you doing? Fine. Mores, things are more moral, don't talk about sex in front of kids, to things that are the law, right? Folkways, mores, and the law, where we actually write it down. It's so serious you write it down. And the sanction is also written down. If you do this, you'll get 10 years in prison. So that continuum has a line in it. The line divides what's informal deviance, folkways and mores, and what's formal deviance, breaking the law, whether it's speeding, jaywalking, embezzling your taxes from your workplace, or murdering somebody. So so how do we determine that line? Because it's a social construction, that line. Pot was a crime and now it's not, right? That's a social construction. Racial segregation wasn't a crime and now it is, right? That line is a social construction. We have to determine. There's probably something that you love right now that will be outlawed. What about the notion that now, the cops are enforcing wearing masks in public? How did that happen, right? I mean, these things can change. And so much for free speech, right? You got free speech and right to assemble. Nope. You are a health risk, and now you're going to get locked up for opening your beauty salon. So these things are all social construction. So how do we determine where that line is? Good question. We're drinking the white wine tonight. So there are three questions. The first question that we ask when we're determining where the line is what are the consequences of the act? What happens because someone commits this act? Are they hurting themselves? Are they hurting other people? Are they hurting nobody? In Utah, they just legalized polygamy. That it is, you can have more than one wife. So there you go. Wait, let me check on that. Yeah, I was right. That's Utah. Consenting adults. If you want to have multiple sister wives, go for it, Utah. Can't have wine or coffee. But you can have those sister wives. So, these things are always changing. So the first question, to get back to the first question is it the act or the consequence of the act? So I'm going to give you a really easy example about this and how we think of things as being deviant when the act has different consequences. So we're going to take an act through 3 scenarios, and the act is drinking and driving. And I'm going to tell you, I joke about about wine, but I'm going to tell you, don't drink and drive. It is a bad thing. I was put through a windshield by a drunk driver, and somebody was killed in that accident. And so it's a very serious thing. But having said that, it's very easy, the way the laws are written and the amount of blood alcohol that is technically drunk that will get you a DUI, driving under the influence. It's very easy to go out for dinner and have a couple glasses of wine, a beer or 2, get home to, get in your car to drive home and be technically drunk, legally, based on the statute in Oregon. And you know how it works, I think. Maybe you do. It's like, you're like, yeah, close enough. I can make it home, right? And so there are a lot of people who are driving who probably shouldn't be, right? Especially on a Friday or Saturday night. There's a lot of people at 2 a.m. who are just making it home, and they're, but for the grace of God, they make it home. So scenario number 1 is you're driving, a little bit buzzed, maybe you shouldn't be, and you make it home. Scenario number 2 is you're driving a little bit buzzed, and there's a cop behind you, and they notice you're swerving, and woo, and you get a ticket. Right, which is a big deal. Like, that's thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars that you have to spend, and it's holy hell, which is why you shouldn't drink and drive. Scenario number 3 is the same amount of alcohol, same amount of drunkenness. I can make it home. You drive home and you run over somebody and kill them. Now you're looking at homicide. So it's the same act, but in each one it has sort of greater and greater consequences. The first one, no harm, no foul, you made it home. Second one, you were recognized by the state as a criminal. The third one, somebody was killed because of your negligence, right? So we really draw the line there, because it's not about driving drunk. It's about what happens because you drove drunk. So the first question we ask is, what are the consequences of an act? And this is why we're getting into this discussion about drug legalization that we'll talk about in a little bit. Because if you're just, getting yourself high, why not just go ahead and legalize heroin? One of the benefits of the remote teaching, when I'm on campus, I'm not having a glass of wine while I'm lecturing, although maybe I should. It seems so civilized now, doesn't it? The second question is, who are the individuals involved in the act? Now, this is where we get into all our stereotypes and all our biases and all our bigotries that are built into society. There's a great book I used to have my criminology students read called The Rich Get Richer and the Poor Get Prison, and about how we have a real class bias in our criminal justice system that targets poor and minority people. And I'm going to include a link. Normally in this class, when we're not talking about the chalice and the blade, we talk a lot about race and crime and the intersection of race and crime and the imbalance of that, which we'll certainly talk about in this lecture. But we watch a movie called The House I Built In, which is a brilliant film about how racist our criminal justice system is. And so in my college Emory University was in Atlanta, and Atlanta, especially in the 1980s, there was a regular nightly raid in the housing projects, which were overwhelmingly African American. This police force called the Red Dog Squad would go into the projects and just find a kid with a little bit of weed on him or her and throw him to the ground and book them, and they would spend the rest of their life in the criminal justice system. I guarantee you there was twice as much weed on the Emory campus, and the cops never, ever, ever showed up. In fact, there was a fraternity house on campus that was the main distributor of cocaine, not just for the campus, but for the area. And everybody knew when that particular fraternity house, I had a friend there, told me all about it, that when they got a shipment from Miami, there would be a big party at this particular frat house, and there would be cocaine all over campus the next day. there was never a single cop showing up at the frat house. They were showing up at the crack house, but they weren't showing up at the frat house. So the second question is about who is involved in the act that allows us to draw that line. I mean, it's very interesting about how, we talk about the plague of drugs, but the opioid epidemic is a public health crisis. Those people that are addicted to, to painkillers aren't criminals. They have addiction problems. Well, why didn't we use the same narrative when we were talking about poor black people who were addicted to crack cocaine? So the second question is about who is involved in the act and how it reflects the biases that are already there in society. I'll give you a little story for that. Here's our little story that I'm going to tell on YouTube. I'm a big Beatles fan. You know it. I have a freaking Yoko Ono poster right there. There's a whole section right here. It's all Beatle related. John Lennon was murdered brutally in front of his apartment in New York City on December 8th, 1980. Worst day of my life to this point. I remember it so well. I was 16-year-old and just crushed that a Beatle had been murdered in America. On the 20th anniversary of that murder, there's a place. So where John Lennon lived is a building called the Dakota. Beautiful building, and it's right next to Central Park. And his widow, Yoko Ono, if you don't know Yoko, had a park created there called Strawberry Fields, named after the Beatles song, and it's kind of a gathering place for Beatles fans. And I've been there many times. It's a beautiful little place. But on the 20th anniversary, December 8th, the year 2000, I'm like, I got to be there. I wasn't there in 1980. I need to be there on the 20th anniversary. So I fly all the way to New York City, cold winter New York City, and me and a friend of mine get to Strawberry Fields, and Yoko has put a candle in the window to sort of approve of all these fans who are getting together and singing John Lennon songs and Beatles songs, and are singing Imagine, and all You Need Is Love, all these great songs. So we're there freezing but enjoying the bonhomie, the sort of brotherhood of all these Beatle fans, and a joint gets passed around. But I'm like, it's for John. I mean, the Beatles played a big role in turning America onto pot in the world. I mean, the story is Bob Dylan turned the Beatles on the pot, and the Beatles turned the world on the pot, and they wrote some pretty good records while they were getting stoned. Picture yourself in a boat on a river. Anyway, so I'm like, all right, it's for John. So I take a drag, and immediately there's a tap on my shoulder. I turn around, and it's a New York cop. And I'm like, holy crap. Because I know New York, this is when Rudy Giuliani was the mayor of New York, and there were pretty serious drug laws. There was zero tolerance. For one joint, you would be going to Rikers. You would be locked up in one of the worst jails in America. And I was like, oh, and he's like, come with me. And of course, I can't believe I'm telling this. Please don't show this video to my mother. And I'm holding the pot smoke in. And since I don't know that much about pot, I didn't realize, like, the more you hold it in, the stoner you get. Stoneder. So I'm walking, the cop's dragging me over to the side, and he says, I saw what you did. I saw what that was, because I sort of, like, passed it on as soon as I and I just looked at him, and my eyes were kind of glazed, and I said, but it's for John Lennon, goo goo gajoob. Those were my exact words as the pot smoke poured out into his face. And then I started what I call my little white privilege dance. Well, I'm from Oregon. Oregon, the laws are different in Oregon. At the time in Oregon, it was just a violation. You just got a ticket for a small amount of pot. I'm a college professor. I came all this way to be here for John Lennon. Somebody passed it to me. I'm a criminologist. I work with law enforcement. I started saying, like, every little privilege thing I could say. And then the cop said, all right. I'm going to tell you what. I'm not going to arrest you. I'm just going to exclude you from Central Park. You can't be here for 24 hours. Get out of the park. And of course, I'm like, woo! And then I, start to leave, and I realize that I can't believe I'm telling this time. I came all that way to be there. I came all that way to hang out with Beatles fans and mourn the passing of John Lennon. And I was kind of a little bit baked, so I went around the corner and I bought a hat. Because he's never going to recognize me, because, all white people look alike. Put on the hat and walked right back into the crowd. Like, yeah, everything's cool. I didn't get busted by the cops. And my friend said, Randy, you're so lucky. I said, what are you talking about? I mean, I know I'm lucky. I thought I was going to get arrested, and I'm still here. He's like, no, you're still lucky. You're so lucky. And I'm like, well, what do you mean? I said, look. And there was that exact same cop off to the side with a young African-American man handcuffing him, his hands behind the back, and arresting him for drug possession. Maybe the same pot joint that I smoked. And I was like, there you go. There's my white privilege. There's the bias in the system right in front of my eyes. Like, I did that. I walked away, got a hat, walked right back in. No harm, no foul. That kid did the same thing that I did. Didn't have the white privilege card to pull out, and is now handcuffed, and now has, if he had, has a criminal conviction probably. So there's a real bias in the system. And so the second question is all about, how does the act, who is committing the act, who's doing it that says this is a crime, right? Black person goes on a shooting, that's a crime. White person goes on a shooting, oh, they must be mentally ill. They must have really had a screw loose or something, right? I mean, it really looks at how the biases of society are reflected in the definition of what's criminal. And then the third one, so the first one is what are the consequences? The second is who's doing it. The third is, what are the community standards? How does the community sanction? Because the community standards vary. We don't have one uniform culture. I've been talking a lot in my diversity class about hate crime laws, and hate crimes are crimes that are motivated by hate to protect people based on their race, religion, national origin, gender identity, sexuality, sexual orientation. In the South, not so much. In the South, sexual orientation is not, if you beat up somebody because they're gay, it's not a hate crime. You're just doing the Lord's work. So what is, the local standards really matter. There's a really great example, speaking of the South. I don't know if anybody remembers Blockbuster Video. In the old days, we used to rent movies, take them home, watch them, and then rewind them and bring them back to Blockbuster. There was an Academy Award-winning film called Bang the Tin Drum, I think was the name of it. It was won the Oscar for Best Foreign Film in the early 80s. And in this film, there was some child nudity in it, but it's an art film. But it was on the shelves of Blockbusters all over the country. But a manager at a Blockbuster store rented it to an undercover cop and got busted for child pornography. In the standards in that community, that wasn't an art film, that wasn't an Oscar-winning movie, that was kiddie porn, and that guy went to prison. I mean, fortunately, they overthrew it in the Court of Appeals, but the local standards. So what the values are on a local level matter. So, for example, think about jaywalking. And jaywalking, some places it's very, very serious. In some places, nobody pays any attention to it. So local standards matter. So those three questions are ways of determining if that line is going to get drawn between informal deviance and formal deviance. What are the consequences of the act? How does the act, who's committing the act, and how does that reinforce, the biases that are in society, right? Especially racism and classism and sexism. And then what are the community standards around that act? Those three things help us determine where the line is. Okay. I feel like I should be singing a Dean Martin song or something. You'll never know. I want to talk about sort of the typology of crime, how we organize crime in terms of categories, and why this is important. Social scientists love to organize crime categories, but so do criminologists and cops. There's a lot of ways of creating a typology. The ancient Greeks created a typology of crimes against men and crimes against the gods, sort of heresy. The French created crimes based on what they felt was the seriousness of the crime, which is where we get the idea of violation, misdemeanor, and felony. The British organized crimes alphabetically because that's what English people do. So assault and arson were together, and burglary and buggery were right together. We organize crime in kind of a different typology. Our typology is based on who is impacted by the act. And so what we're going to be using is the FBI crime typology for this discussion. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, for those of you that don't know, this is their typology of crime. The first type are what we call violent crimes. Violent crimes are crimes against a person's body. So they're murder, assault, rape. When you're strangling someone or killing them or beating them up. So, we talk about violent crimes. These are the crimes, when we say crime, and most people think violent crimes, even though there are a small percentage of crimes. Violent crimes are the ones that get the attention because, you're bleeding. You've got a knife in your back. Kind of makes the news. The second type of crime are property crimes, crimes against people's property or stuff. So here we include all types of stealing. So larceny, the most common crime in America is petty larceny, stealing something minor, much more than violent crime. And so getting your laptop stolen or getting your backpack stolen or your purse stolen or your something out of the back of your car, getting your bicycle stolen, petty larceny, burglary, breaking into someone's house, you're breaking the house to steal the stuff, and vandalism is a property crime where you're spray painting. Class of 2020. Damn it. Class of 2020. I missed prom. Whatever you're spray painting up, that's vandalism. That's a property crime. Arson, setting buildings on fire. That can be for many reasons, but including being a pyromaniac. But so property crimes affect property. But here's an interesting little riddle. Where would you put armed robbery? Somebody comes up to you and says they have a gun. It says your money or your life. Is that a property crime or a violent crime? Right? Could be a property crime because the goal of the crime is to steal your stuff. If they shoot you in the process, then it becomes a violent crime. But would it be a property crime? It's a little bit of both. And the FBI used to have robbery as a property crime because the goal of a property crime is to steal someone's property. And if you stab them or punch them in the process, you can add a violent crime to it. They have since moved robbery into the violent crime category because the threat of violence is a form of violence in of itself. That is making someone afraid. So ask me to talk about the time I got mugged in Washington, D.C. If you want a good story about is property crime a violent crime or is robbery a violent crime or a property crime? That was fun. I actually interviewed the person who was mugging me, and they were quite confused. So, violent crime, property crime. The third type of crime is what we call victimless crime. Victimless crime is who's being affected is the person who's committing the act. So, victimless crime, we have sort of the big three categories of victimless crime. We have drug use and drug sales, like using drugs, all drug-related crimes, because people are only hurting themselves. People are choosing to do methamphetamines or choosing to do heroin or choosing to do cocaine or choosing to do the loco weed, that you're only hurting yourself. So drugs are one example of victimless crimes. Prostitution, you're only hurting yourself if you're engaging in prostitution because of all the diseases that you can get, I suppose. And consenting adults, right? Consenting adults should be allowed to exchange money for sex. You're only hurting yourself. And the third is gambling. That you're gambling and you're only hurting yourself by gambling all your money away. You're not hurting it. No, who gets hurt? You're only hurting yourself. But when we say victimless crimes, we really have to say victimless crimes because we know that there are victims associated with these crimes. There are victims associated with the drug trade. I mean, just, you don't have to go down to Mexico to find people who are physical casualties of violence because of the drug trade. There are people who are the victims of prostitution. What if a guy, catches a sexually transmitted disease from a prostitute and comes home and gives it to his wife? Then she's a victim. And of course, the sex trafficking industry is horribly victimization. Well, I don't have to say how, but our patriarchal society, the way we've glorified pimps are sex traffickers. Pimps are slave traders. Pimps are no different than the people who traded in African slaves 200 years ago. So but somehow we've glorified them. But in fact, they're engaged in a lot of kidnapping, a lot of sexual abuse, and there's all kinds of victims. And as gambling as well has victims. I mean, there is a reason places like Reno and Las Vegas have really high crime rates, because if you've ever gambled and lost your money, you know the feeling that, well, if I just had $100, I could win it all back. I don't have $100, but where am I going to get it? That old lady looks like she has $100. Why don't I just go hit her over the head? And, I'm sorry, lady, but I got to win my money back, right? I mean, there are victims associated with gambling as well. People lose things in their family, all of a sudden are out on the streets because dad gambled all the money on the horses. There's victims. But in that category, the discussion is, maybe since people are doing this largely to themselves, but also having all these extra victims, maybe they shouldn't be crimes. Maybe we should decriminalize or legalize. And that's what we've done. In Oregon, we've legalized a lot of forms of gambling, right? And there's casinos right down the road. Have you been to Ilani up in Washington? It's awesome. You can play craps and roulette, right? We've legalized it. We've legalized video poker, and we've found ways of legalizing it and controlling it. We've legalized prostitution in Nevada, right? They have brothels that you go to, and those women who work, and I imagine probably a few men, get checkups from the health services every month to make sure they're not transmitting sexually transmitted diseases. And we also have a conversation about are people who work in the porn field prostitutes. We've decriminalized that line of work, even though they're being paid to have sex. So we've decriminalized that. And of course, the big one, and we're going to get into this a little bit later, is decriminalizing drug use, right? I mean, marijuana was a pretty serious offense in many states, and is now available at the local store. Because we made decisions to take this behavior, since it was mainly affecting individuals, themselves, their own bodies, to move it out of the criminal category and stop sending these people to prison. So we're going to come back to that one. So 3 is victimless, and 4 are what we call white-collar crimes. White-collar crimes are crimes against institutions, when you're ripping off the man, when you're ripping off some institution. So the classic type of white-collar crime is embezzlement, when you're stealing from where you're working from. Stealing from where you work from. So, we talk about cooking the books or doing some creative accounting. I mean, there's a great quote that says the best way to own... I miss the classroom. When there was just coffee to drink. There's a great quote that says the best way to rob a bank is to own a bank. Let's say I'm working at a bank and I have I have a job that involves some technical aspect of banking, and I create a little program that says every time you use your debit card, there's a 1 cent add-on that is a service fee that goes into a personal bank account that I have in Switzerland. Right? I can make millions of dollars out of that because nobody uses cash anymore. Everybody uses their debit card, and you never notice it. So there are ways of stealing from the place that you work, and that can be money, embezzling funds, or that can be taking stuff. If I were on campus at PCC, and I was like, man, I'm out of copy paper at home. I see all these big stacks of copy paper that we use for the printer, and I take one of those home. That's embezzlement. I'm stealing from the place that I work from. That is a form of embezzlement. But other types of white collar crime, are things like tax evasion, or this is a sexy one, regulation violation. It's against the law to dump toxic waste in the Willamette River, and I think that's a good thing. I think a lot of regulations are there to keep people safe. Environmental regulations, safety regulations. If I violate those laws, right, I'm committing a criminal act. If I dump my toxic waste into the Willamette, or if I don't create a safe environment for my workers, or if I don't follow, environmental regulations, I'm violating the law. Insider trading, trading stocks on inside tips that aren't public knowledge, white collar crime. Forgery, white collar crime. Counterfeiting, white collar crime. Price fixing, when companies get together and say the price of a gallon of gas is not going to go below, $1.89. That's a violation of antitrust laws. And so these are typically associated not with street criminals, but with sort of high power corporate elites. And the average age sort of goes up, and they get to start look a lot like the guys on Wall Street. In fact, if you've ever seen the movie The Lion of Wall Street with Leonardo DiCaprio, it's a great movie about white collar crime. Not quite as sexy as murder, but can have a huge impact. And as we'll talk about, white collar crimes actually cost us more in terms of dollars out of our pocket, but they can also kill people. We've had examples of mine collapse where the mines collapsed and killed dozens and dozens of workers because the owner of the mine didn't want to spend the money to follow the regulations to make sure those mine shafts were safe. So he broke the law, violated a regulation. Oh, regulations are bad. And then the mine collapsed and killed all those workers. The mine owner never goes to prison in those cases. Best pay a fine. So when we start talking about crimes, we have to make sure that we include white collar crimes, which ultimately take more money out of our pockets and in terms of higher fees. Insurance fraud jacks up the cost of your insurance premium because people are ripping off insurance companies and claiming things that don't exist, and the insurance company has to pay out. They don't pay for that. They just pass the cost of that along to you. And so we end up paying out millions and millions and millions of dollars for white collar crimes, but also people die. People get cancer because of the toxic waste in the Willamette River. They die because mines collapse. Things fall off of shelves at Home Depot because they aren't following the rules, and people are squashed to death. I mean, white collar crimes have a real body count behind them and a real dollar amount. And so when we talk about these four types of crime, violent crime, property crime, victimless crime, white collar crime, we tend to not even talk about white collar crime. People don't even know what it is, but ultimately it is much more harmful to us as a society. So what we're going to do in the next section, I'm going to wrap this part one up. In part two, we're going to talk about why we have this stereotype of crime, why we don't focus on white collar crime and the crimes of corporate elites, for example. We focus on the guy on the street who's got a little bit of weed in his pocket, and maybe, belonged to a gang when he was a kid. So we're going to focus on that next, but I'm going to wrap this up. Now, it was part one of our discussion of crime. I think that's enough for now.